All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name's Cedar Riener, and I'll be talking today about teaching and learning while the world keeps burning, teaching psychology in a world of crisis. I'm hearing a few more dings, so I'll let people keep coming in. That's great. And I will get started. Here we go. Great. Okay, so I've got my PowerPoint shared here, and my video is spotlighted for everyone. I will be keeping an eye on the chat, so if you have any questions, I'd welcome any questions in the chat. And other than that, you can also unmute if you're unable to type in the chat and ask a question. That would be fine as well. Okay, I think I'll get started then. I think I'm all ready. Yes. Okay, so teaching and learning while the world keeps burning, psychology of the world in crisis. This is a presentation loosely structured around a class I taught here at Randolph-Macon this semester. And let's see, speaker view. Okay, this semester, and it's basically on how to look at the crises that are happening in our world and relate the psychology that we're teaching, relate kind of current psychology that we're teaching to the crises that our students and we are experiencing. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement that I'm here in Ashland, Virginia on Yautjanund land. I see that the Advancing Social Justice purpose of this conference provided some nice links on the program, and there's a website, nativeland.ca, which I think is a great resource for exploring the indigenous past of the place that you're at. I also wanted to, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, acknowledge and thank all of you for being here. I think high school psychology teachers are immensely important, and high school social studies as well. I'd also say I'm married to a high school social studies teacher. My wife teaches 12th grade government here in Virginia. And so I've been kind of experiencing some of the struggles, not exactly, but witnessing them at least. And I'm just really grateful for all of you for being here on a Saturday afternoon, I guess it is here in Virginia. And I'm just also very grateful for the work that you're doing in a tremendously difficult time to do it. Okay, so the world is in crisis. I think we're all aware of that. And I'd like to show that I think it's a way that psychology can help us recognize the crises in our world and help students see how they can cope with the crises and how they can see positive ways of acting to repair the crises. So I think this isn't just because I'm a teacher of sensation and perception, but I think the first step to any crisis is recognizing that it is a crisis and opening our eyes. And that's a specialty of psychology, to open students' eyes. I think it's also a favorite section for many students and teachers of psychology, that focusing on the process of perception and beginning psychology that way, and also relating it to recognizing when crises are occurring. So I think of learning about crisis, and especially is the kind of crisis of misinformation, that one of the chief values of psychology can give us, and the study sensation and perception can give us, is a kind of openness that we're not just getting only the truth in our eyes, we're not getting the actual world through our eyes. I like to think of this in terms of epistemic humility, a little bit of humility about the source of our knowledge and whether our knowledge is truly certain. So I've got a few illusions. I like to use illusions kind of as icebreakers in most of my classes. But I think it's also a good introduction and good metaphor for recognizing crises in the world. So the first illusion I have is from the Japanese mathematician Kokichi Sugihara. and he designs 3D figures that look different from different perspectives. So this is a key thing, a big message that we do in a lot of our psychology courses is the world looks different depending on your perspective. So this is a 3D object.
Dang it.
This is a 3D object that I've printed out here at Randolph-Macon, and a 3D object that looks like it's cylinders. Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Dr. Riener. I tried to mute everyone and it muted you too. That's my fault.
That's fine, no problem at all. So this is a 3D object, looks like it's cylinders. And if I flip it over, it looks like it's squares, cylinders, squares. And it's a great little illusion that the way the world appears depends on your perspective. And you can see here that it's got some interesting ridges on that object that make it look like squares from one angle and cylinders from another. Another one of my favorite illusions is on the desk behind me. It's my Rubik's Cube. And this is a Rubik's Cube that is, in fact, a flat piece of paper. Good, Daria. So that is, this works out great if you print it on photo paper. And you can see it's a Rubik's Cube from one perspective. But in fact, if I put it flat to the camera, that's what it looks like. That's my Rubik's Cube. The world is not always as it appears, which I think is a great message to start lots of our psychology classes with, and also a good message to start thinking about the psychology of crisis. Okay, so psychology of crisis, I start out with 3 crises, and I'd like to begin with some of my, I won't say favorite, but I think the most compelling ways of seeing these as crises. But first, I'm going to talk about a little bit more about the ways of thinking about the crisis and how psychology can help us see them better. And I was thinking of the kind of zooming in and zooming out as a way that I talk about psychology and the different levels of psychology that is particularly suitable for our Zoom age, right? And I think psychology is a great science for helping students see that learning psychology can help us see the world and ourselves in different scales. So there's ways of looking at the world by zooming in on the cells in our brains, right? On brain cells, there's ways of zooming in on those. And then we can also zoom out and see social phenomena, cultural phenomena. This is the graph, the figure that I show my students on the first day of class about psychology studies psychological phenomena at all of these levels. We can talk about cultural psychology, social psychology of relationships and groups, behavioral psychology of human behaviors, how people behave the way they do, thoughts, feelings, and perceptions, cognitive psychology, and then neuroscience and physiological psychology includes the brain, hormones, and like behavioral genetics also includes the chemistry and DNA of how those things determine our behavior. I often like to dwell on this point for a little bit, these different levels of analyses, and suggest to students that it's not that things get more scientific the lower you get on this flowchart, right? So that just because you're looking at the brain and the biology of the brain doesn't mean that it's that it's more scientific or sort of more at the root of these phenomena than behavior or culture. So people who do science of cultural psychology, sometimes that's the best level of analysis to study these phenomena. And you can do that with social sciences. So I try to push back whenever I hear someone say like, oh, once we really understand that in the brain, it's like, no, sometimes really understanding something is understanding the level of behavior and not just how it happens in the brain. Zooming in and zooming out, I think, especially in terms of thinking about crisis, we also need to think about time. I love this quote from William Faulkner that the past is never dead, it's not even past. And I think when thinking about these crises and how they apply to our psychology, we need to include history. The history of these crises affect how we understand them now psychologically, and they affect how we're coping with them psychologically, and what are the barriers to repairing them psychologically. I also like this quote from the author William Gibson on the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. So the idea here is that he meant this in terms of technology, but I think it's a useful term in thinking about crisis, that different communities are more in crisis than others. Different communities are feeling the future of the crisis right now. And so zooming out in terms of time and space, I think is a really useful way and metaphor of understanding crisis and understanding the psychology of the crisis, is that if we can expand our own viewpoint to other places and other times, that's going to help us get a better understanding of the crisis. Okay, 3 crises: the COVID-19 pandemic, crisis of climate change, and crisis of racism in our society. I'll say I'm going to start with some what I think are compelling examples of why these are a crisis, but then I'm going to continue into the psychology of the crisis. But I'm going to begin with some more of the kind of statistics and graphs of why these are crises. So I actually think a way of understanding the COVID-19 crisis, instead of looking at the graphs probably that appear so much on the news of daily cases or daily hospitalizations or deaths, I think excess mortality is a better and more realistic understanding of, let me see, here we go. Excess mortality is a better, more realistic understanding of the true scope of the crisis. And what we can see here is this is the gray and black lines are 2015 through 2019, the total number of deaths in the United States. So on January 5th, 2015, or in January 2015, approximately 50,000 people died per week in January of 2015. What you're seeing in the black line here is the average of mortality from 2015 to 2019. And let's see. And what you're seeing here in the red line is 2020. So this isn't just only COVID deaths, but this is deaths that are in addition of the pattern from the past 5 years. So this has been a tremendously deadly year in the United States and in the world, and that is due to COVID, even if each of these individuals didn't die of COVID on their death certificate, or their bodies didn't die of COVID. A lot of people have died of the COVID pandemic and of the consequences of the COVID pandemic. Another way of understanding the scope of the COVID pandemic is this is hospitalizations from the National Hospital Association. What you can see here is average daily census of people in the hospital. There's about 600,000 people in US hospitals on any given day from 2014 to 2018. So pretty remarkably stable there. It's kind of interesting for me to see. And what I'll also say here is that usually the most prevalent reason that people are in the hospital is childbirth. So about 10% of those numbers on any given day are childbirth. If you look at the statistics for COVID in the past few weeks, there are about 100,000 people in the hospital for COVID right now. That's about 1 in 6 people in the hospital in the United States is in the hospital because of COVID. So this is a tremendously deadly disease, tremendously dangerous. And right now it is the most common reason that people are in the hospital. I'll also find a connection here to mental health that we're just beginning to get more of an understanding that hospitalization and death is not the only effects of COVID. That, as you can see from these quotes, a lot of people have what's called long haul COVID or long COVID, that after the acute symptoms of the first few weeks have passed, people have mental health symptoms that can last months and months. I'll just let you read those quotes. Okay, so I think we're still just beginning to understand the effects of COVID, not just on hospitalizations and cases, but also on people's mental health over a long term. We can also think about the social connections of COVID, that right now, majority, and this is as of end of November, this is from Pew Research Center, and a majority of US adults now know someone who's been hospitalized or has died from COVID. And so that certainly wasn't the case in April, but now in November and December, and this line is just going up. And in fact, it's probably an underestimate because many people probably know someone who they haven't had contact with in a few months or something like that, that has been hospitalized or died. So this is an underestimate, but the majority of US adults say they know someone who's been hospitalized or died of COVID. And what should be a kind of precursor to the crisis of racism that I'm going to talk about at the end. This, as you can see, the racial disparities in this statistic here, that Black Americans and Hispanic Americans are far more likely to know someone who has been hospitalized or died from COVID. So I like this as a reminder that COVID is affecting our families and our communities, but it's also unequally affecting our families and our communities through the social connections that we have. Okay, climate change. I thought this was an elegant graph based on some data from a study this year on global mean temperature from the past 12,000 years. And what you can see, this is a pretty long time scale, but this recent spike is us in the past 50 years, and global mean temperatures certainly have grown a lot. Another way of understanding the scale of the climate crisis is in terms of weather and climate disasters, which we know through climate change are more extreme than they have been in the past. And this is the record-breaking number of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters just in 2020. So there are tornadoes, severe weather, thunderstorms, hurricanes. This was another record-breaking year for hurricanes, and then wildfires and drought and heat wave. So this is affecting the whole country in different ways, and certainly affecting the world in different ways. This is a quote from an article in 2015 by Elizabeth Colbert in the New Yorker about flooding in Miami. And I saved this quote to share with psychology teachers and psychology students. This is a quote from Elizabeth Hammer, who's a environmental studies researcher and outreach coordinator who goes around Miami helping people understand what they're seeing. And she's just gotten finished talking with someone who lives in an apartment who's trying to call the superintendent of the apartment to tell them to deal with the water in the street. that keeps happening. And this is someone who's a biologist, who's an environmental studies person, saying they wish they had taken more psychology classes because they're understanding this isn't a scientific problem at this point. It's a psychological problem of helping people to understand. She's likening it to bedside manner in medical school as well. And I think we can also see that as psychologists, right? This is an often neglected portion of health education, of science education, is communicating with people and understanding the psychology of breaking bad news, understanding the psychology of climate change. The crisis of racism. Psychologists have a lot to contribute to understanding the crisis of racism in our country. This is work from Jennifer Richardson, Julius Rucker, and Michael Kraus. Jennifer Richardson and her group have done a lot of really amazing research on this. And this graph takes a little bit of explaining, and I'm going to use the pen here. But I'll just say part of the crisis of racism in our country has to be understood as a crisis of denial and denying the inequality that is kind of in front of our eyes, really. And what Jennifer Richardson and her colleagues have done here is they've asked thousands and thousands of people. This is from 2017, but they've done a lot of these different studies. And they ask people to estimate how much racial inequality is there on economic indicators. So they ask people, in modern times, estimate inequality from these past moments, right? So the person is in 2017 and they're asking them, okay, in 1963, what was Black wealth if white wealth was 100? Okay, so if white wealth was 100, if you estimated that Black wealth on average was 100, you would estimate that equality is 100, okay? Some people, not very many, each dot here is an estimate. Some people estimate that Black people had twice the amount of wealth as white people in 1963. Most people, on average, estimate about 50%, that in 1963, Black wealth was about 50%. So what we're seeing here, what I've circled here are the estimates of people, the average estimates. And you can see that you ask people in 2017, and they, on average, as years go on, they estimate that there has been progress. They estimate progress over the course of the past 50, 60 years. The black diamonds here are the actual economic data. So what we're seeing here and what Jennifer Richardson and Michael Kraus and their colleagues have demonstrated is that there's a widespread denial of racial inequality in economic indicators. And I'll say, I mean, when I first saw this data, I certainly, I'd say that I'm a pretty educated person, and I'd say that I am interested in the effects of racism on our society, but I would still have been in, I would not have been up here, certainly, but if I had been in this study, I probably would have been much more, in the range of where a lot of people are, right? And so this was somewhat of a wake-up call for me as well, and kind of, yeah, shocking, I'd say. Another way of thinking about racism in social studies, and I think this is a set of studies that can integrate political science and sociology and psychology, is the effects of mass incarceration, growth of mass incarceration in our society, and the racial inequality there. So the bar chart on the left is just a stark depiction of the average rate of incarceration and the racialized experience of mass incarceration in our society. So there's certainly tons and tons of data on that. On the psychology and sociology side, this is a study from a sociologist named Diva Pager. She tragically passed away at the age of 46, just a number of years, just 3 or 4 years ago. But this is work in her doctoral dissertation where she had 4 people send out their resumes to hundreds and hundreds of jobs. So they found hundreds and hundreds of jobs, and she had 4 people send out their resumes, and these were fake resumes designed to be equivalent, you know, along a lot of different dimensions. So the dimensions would be like similar education, similar backgrounds, similar qualifications, but they would be systematically varied along race and along whether the person had a criminal record or not. Thank you, Leah, for bringing that up. So the Racial Equity Institute at UNC uses this study, good. So they, Diva Pager found that the y-axis here is a percentage being called back when they submitted this, their resumes. And Black applicants had a much lower percentage of being called back than white applicants in general. So that's the first thing you should notice, that there is a racial difference. And then the other thing you should notice is that black bars are the criminal record indicated on the resume, maybe from job experience in a correctional facility or something like that. And the effect of the criminal record was severely detrimental on both groups, but also putting, you also notice there's a racialized element such that the Black applicants without criminal records were about as likely, slightly less likely to get a callback than the white applicants with criminal records. So criminal records were detrimental to all job applicants, but in addition to the racial disparity. Okay, so these are crises. I hope I've convinced you of that. I hope you've gotten some compelling examples maybe to share with your students. How do we begin to think about these crises in psychology and psychology terms? Let me see. Great. Okay. So how can psychology help us understand? I like to group these into recognition, right? So the recognition of the crisis, we can think about psychologically. How can psychology help us cope or show us how we can be resilient? And how can psychology help us act? So there's certainly barriers to action that we can understand the psychology of these things. Let's see. Great. So first, and I'm going to go through each crisis and kind of give some suggestions for thinking about the psychological elements. So one word that I shared with my students and I'll share with you is it was from a letter to The Lancet, a medical journal, preeminent medical journal. And this doctor was arguing that we shouldn't talk about COVID as a pandemic, but as a syndemic, that we should consider these public health elements as biological, medical issues, but also social interactions, social inequality, psychological factors are hugely important in the spread of the virus, in the experience of the virus, and even in kind of the medical consequences of the virus. And I like sharing that with my students, and I will share it. Oh, why don't I do this now? Zoom now lets us share a file, and I have put together some materials that I will share with you. Let me see.
Cedar, if you send it to me, I can also make sure everybody gets it, if that's
great.
easier.
I think maybe I'll do that, yeah, because it's letting me share with Dropbox or Google Drive. I will just send you a zip file of all the files. So all the sources that I've got, I will share those with you, as well as a number of the kind of other materials. Great. Okay. So is a letter just, including, urging the medical community to include social and psychological factors in understanding the pandemic. I liked using a different word for this because I think we really need to shift our imaginations to include psychological factors, and sometimes a different word is a good example of that. Certainly, we should listen to epidemiologists. We should listen to doctors. But sometimes doctors and epidemiologists are not, in fact, the relevant experts on who talks to who when about what, which might actually be more important in understanding certain elements of the syndemic. Okay, so how do we take some of the concepts that we're talking about in psychology in the regular psychology course in your regular content and include it in our discussion of the pandemic or the syndemic? I think habituation is a great concept in learning. In fact, my son is a high school senior right now, and he's taking AP psychology. So I've gotten a bit of an experience to talk with him about his experience of he's on the learning section right now and talking about classical conditioning. And I think habituation is something that readily applies to the pandemic. This is a picture of, I think is that Chicago? It's a city where you're at the top of a building, you're able to look down.
Chicago.
It is at Chicago.
It's the Spirit Tower.
And you can habituate to this, right? Like that is scary. That is, I mean, that's scary to me just looking at this picture, right? But you can habituate people. The people who built these tall buildings have habituated to the fear of heights and able to do that and look down without feeling the response. So we can habituate to amazing things. We can get used. Humans are very good at getting used to stuff. And I think that's a really important way of understanding the crisis and way of understanding the psychology of these crises. So habituating to masks is good, right? So I've got, in fact, got my favorite mask, and there it is, right? I've even got my filter in it. And I can tell you, I was uncomfortable wearing masks in April and May. It was a little hot. You know, I had masks probably that weren't as comfortable. But now I hardly notice it. And in fact, sometimes I like it because it's getting cold and my lips don't get chapped. So we can get used to masks. I mean, we should know that. We should recognize that people get used to things on their bodies, right? We can get used to hats. We can get used to glasses. We can get used to masks. And people have already experienced that. We can get used to video. I'm much better at doing this than I would have been in March and April. If you were in my classes at Randolph-Macon, you would probably be, you know, hopefully you'd be impressed that I'm much better at looking at the camera now, even though I'm sure I glance off a lot. Much better at looking at the camera, being on video, much better at navigating Zoom. Some of this is habituation, right? Just getting used to getting used to the nature of these tools, getting used to the awkwardness of looking at yourself in the mirror. So that is part of habituation. And if we just practice, we get used to these things. We should also understand that there's a dark side to habituation, right? We can get habituated to risks. Being on top of a tall building is actually dangerous. And there's a good reason your body just goes crazy. You know, your body goes nuts when you're at the top of a tall building looking down like that. It is actually dangerous, right? Heights are actually dangerous. So habituating ourselves to risks is sometimes a bad thing. And I think of that in some cases around COVID, is that habituating ourselves to the things that we thought are risky is sometimes not actually a good thing that we want to get used to. Habituating ourselves to the deaths and the statistics that we see is also not a good thing. And I think habituating ourselves to the inequality and the unequal experience of these crises is also a problem, and we should seek to be to not adjust ourselves to these crises, to actually fight against them and resist them. I like to share with my students a quote and a speech from Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King actually gave a speech to the American Psychological Association in 1967, and it was sort of towards the end of his life. And I think it was really relevant for psychologists and how psychologists can think about injustice as applying to psychology. I'm gonna see if I can get this to work. All right. Oops. Okay, we're back. Good. So I think we should still be wary of being adjusted or habituating to certain elements of the pandemic. And we should be, like Dr. King suggested, proud to be maladjusted to certain things. Another thing, another connection to the pandemic is that there's a history of research on psychoneuroimmunology, that the impact of stress on disease. And we can see this in studies. My students always enjoy hearing about cold studies, that where students are given a cold on purpose and then paid to stay in a hotel for 2 weeks. There's a great set of studies on these, and basically where college students are paid to stay in a hotel for a couple of weeks while they are given a cold and then studied, and you see an impact of stress and sleep in these controlled conditions on the severity of cold symptoms. And there's really no reason to suggest that the coronavirus would be that much different from cold and flu, that stress can exacerbate and hurt our symptoms and our experience of COVID. So we should think about what we know already from psychoneuroimmunology and the impact of mental health and mental illness on our immune system. Okay, so psychology of the pandemic. This is how I think about repair for psychology of the pandemic. And this is based on National Academy of Sciences report on how to encourage health behaviors. And this is stuff we know from a lot of past efforts, whether it's seatbelts, whether it's the AIDS crisis, that if we want to encourage healthy behaviors, we need to first make the behavior easy to start and repeat. So making it easy to put on a mask, easy to wear a mask. This is something I think our government certainly should have sent out masks in March and April to make the behavior easy to start, easy to repeat. Something to think about: comfortable masks. Think about masks that fit in with my identity, or fit to my face, but also fit to a social signal of some sort. Rewarding to repeat. I think about that with masks and keeping warm, right? That I may actually continue to wear masks well into the future during the cold months as I walk to work here in Virginia. Tying to an existing habit. So it might seem kind of mundane, but like putting masks near the door, finding a spot for it so you don't forget it. Tying it to an existing habit. I got my keys, I got my mask. That's a way to encourage habits. And this is true for many different healthy behaviors, including the healthy behaviors around COVID. Alerting people to conflict when their behavior is in conflict with what's healthy, and providing alternate behaviors. I think this is a really important element to think about with healthy behaviors and healthy habits. Is you can't just stop a bad behavior. You have to have an alternate behavior. So we can't just stop doing all the things that we like doing. We have to have alternates of finding pleasure, finding good things in our habits. And if we can do those in a healthy way, that's a good thing. And then finally, specific and easy to follow rules are really, really important. I know some school systems are trying to do things that are safe for the pandemic, where there are mask rules and distancing rules, and there's 3 feet, there's 6 feet, a lot of different rules get thrown around. And I think it's really, really important to think about the psychological element of rules get followed that are easy to follow. And if you say you have to have a mask on if you're within 6 feet, but really if you're within 3 feet, and maybe if you're in the same room, maybe if you're not, every layer of complexity that you add makes it less likely that the rule will actually be followed. And so I think that's an element that, in fact, a lot of doctors and epidemiologists in arguing, okay, how do aerosols spread? Is it 6 feet? Is it 10 feet? Is it 3 feet? Under which conditions? It would be much better if they just said, if you're inside where you might meet someone else, wear a mask. Like that would be a just much more simple, easy to follow rule. Okay. I'll also say there have been studies on encouraging people to wear masks, encouraging people to have healthy behaviors, and emphasizing empathy is a key way to get people to think about others and to engage in healthy behaviors. And it can be a challenge to be empathetic, especially in moments of high anxiety, but seeking empathy is a much more effective direction for encouraging healthy behaviors than through kind of anger and shame. Okay, climate change. So I've got 15 minutes. Let's see. So I like to present in psychology classes as much as you can, including some of the basic science of climate. I know this is true when I presented this content in my class this fall, that students might not take a climate class. They might not take an environmental studies class. They might not, they might have covered some science of climate in much earlier grades. So I think if you're going to talk about psychology of climate change, some of the basic science of climate and just kind of reinforcing that is a good starter, that the world is warming. Some of the consequences of this are important to understand. But then I think it's very important in psychology. There's been a lot of psychology research around climate change in the past 20 years. And we've got to find connections and social connections. And I think one of the ways to start with this is stories of relatable individuals. And this might vary for your region, finding stories of individuals that are in your communities, in the students' communities, find ways that students can relate to people who are experiencing the effects of climate change and taking action to remediate climate change. I found, let me change this. There we go. There's a TED Talk by Per Espen Stoknes, which I found tremendously useful. And he talks about how to transform apocalypse fatigue. I know we've all been experiencing a lot of apocalypse fatigue these days. And this was a model for doing this in climate change. And I think it's applicable to a lot of other crises. Part of the reasons that people don't like to acknowledge and act on climate, Stoknes divides these into 5 barriers, 5 obstacles where climate news can't get through, that we distance ourselves. We don't think it's going to affect us. We distance ourselves from the news. We see doom and gloom, so we just kind of get depressed and think there's nothing to be done. It's just doom. We feel dissonant with our own behaviors, so we know that our diet might affect climate change, but we don't want to change our diet. We know that our travel habits might affect climate change. We don't want to do that, and so we quickly feel that dissonance and act to reduce the dissonance by thinking it's not as big a deal. Denial, we deny that it's going to change our lives. We deny that it's going to have an impact on us. And then finally, if our attitudes towards climate change get bound up in our many other important identities, that can be a tremendous barrier to accepting climate change and to acting towards climate change. And this certainly can be political identities, but it can also be all sorts of other identities, whether it's our jobs, whether it's our our families, our regions, etc. I will say in my everyday life as a professor, I often would fly to a conference or would think, oh, climate change doesn't affect how I teach in the classroom. And that's kind of a key part of my identity as a professor. And so not seeing climate change as impacting that is a barrier to accepting and to acting on climate change. And I think about that sometimes as I think about my department here is a psychology and neuroscience department. And our neuroscience area is actually in the basement of our building, and it has been flooded a lot over the past 20 years and even more over the past 5 years, which mirrors a lot of climate change. It seems like a freak rainstorm we had 5 years ago that put 3 feet of water in our neuroscience lab, which was absolutely heartbreaking. But I've come to see that as something I can see that connects to climate change and connects to my work, my identity as a professor. Stokeness addresses 5 ways of getting over those barriers to climate action. Social, that reducing the distance by having social connections. So a key way is seeing how climate change affects your community, right? Reducing the distance by seeing how it affects your community. I had a student who's from the Hampton Roads area of Virginia who talked about how the flooding really has an impact on her. And in fact, her mom works for the city. And so flooding is a city issue, a city infrastructure issue, a city political issue, and it is a social issue for her and her family. Doom, seeing ways of being supportive and having simple actions that can improve. There are things that we can do, and those things can address climate change. Let's see, dissonance, and I'm running out of time. Dissonance, having simple behaviors and simple changes that can be made. Again, I think that gets back to some of the issues with behavior change and health behaviors, that that having simple behaviors that can change is a way of avoiding the dissonance. And then finally, I think the story and identity is really, really key part. I kept finding myself coming back to social psychology, talking about climate change and climate science. Is if it's not social and emotional, we're not going to have any action and we're not going to have any recognition. So we have to have communities. We have to see it as a social behavior, and we have to think about the social elements, and that's got to be connecting with the stories, connecting with the individuals on an emotional and social level. And that can be really hard when we're talking about the weather, right? It's a challenge when we're talking about weather or things that happen, changes that happen over 5-10 years. But we've got to make them social. Okay, I've got 10 minutes to talk about psychology of racism. I started with this poem with my students about the elephant in the room. The room is almost all elephant. And I think talking about racism with students these days, if not these days, for a very long time, it often feels like the room is pretty much solid elephant, and there's no room to talk about it. And I think for racism, part of what helps me think about talking about racism with students is a counseling psychology lens and talking about the emotions that students are going to feel, talking about the emotions that I feel, talking about these issues, that if we're going to learn more about racism, if we're going to learn more about the legacy of racism, if we're not feeling strong emotions, we're not really learning, right? And that discomfort is expected and important, but also that psychology and counseling psychology offers us tools for dealing with these emotions and still learning and growing. So I think an important part of recognizing how psychology can help with racism, we have to start with the history. We have to start with recognition of the truth of our legacy of past racism. And I think the Richardson research on wealth inequality, the research on audit studies is an important use for that. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture has a great set of resources. This is a screenshot from their resources. I'm sure many of you know of these already. But I thought having some historical foundations of race and racism are really important. And even in psychology classes, kind of reinforcing some of that. I also think kind of getting at the discomfort to encourage students to have some license to experience some discomfort. I found it useful to experience some discomfort myself and zoom into my personal story around some of these issues. Let's see. And I've been inspired by that, by a training I took, and I'd be remiss if I didn't call them out particularly, Dr. Della Mosley and Paris Bellamy, who's actually still her graduate student, and cast of characters collaborated on this Academics for Black Survival and Wellness training that a lot of higher ed academics took this summer. And I'm really still thinking and being affected by these lessons. Division 56 of the American Psychological Association, the Division of Trauma Psychology, gave this set of trainings an award, their yearly award this year. So it's really a great impact for many, many people. And one of the things I took from that is how I introduce myself and talk about my own experiences as a psychologist is often deracialized, right? Is often I'm the kind of default, this is my experience as a psychologist, not as a white man in psychology. And so that's certainly a way that I've been socialized to introduce myself, a way I've been trained. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and to seek to change it and to seek students to acknowledge their own positions and their own socialization. I'll just give one little example of this, of my personal story. After college, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I worked as an assistant for a psychiatrist. I knew I wanted to do something in psychology, and I worked in DC. I lived at home. I saved some money, and I got a job interview through some family networks, to be honest. I did go as an undergraduate to Harvard, so I think that may have helped. But I wanted to work in psychology and in psychiatry. So I worked with psychiatrists, but I was a white psychiatrist, white assistant. And I worked at, he had an appointment at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which is a think tank. I would not have normally worked for the think tank, and I disagree with a lot of their issues. But I'll say, like, I went to work and I felt like I belonged. And I pulled out the faces of all the people who are the policy advisors and board of directors and president and vice president of this organization right now. And I think this was hard to do, by the way. This took me a while because these faces are not just posted on the website, but it's pretty incredible just to see the sea of white faces there. And that was something that I was able to feel comfortable, and I think that's a part of my unearned privilege and an advantage that I've experienced in my life. And so I think recognizing that when we talk about racism is important for our students to see us acknowledge our own personal history as well as the legacy of racism in our country. Or at least I felt like that for me. And I think that helped with some of our students in acknowledging the emotions they were feeling. I'll also say here, it's probably easier for me to do this when I'm in my office and just staring at a camera than in a big room with all of you. I'd be much more embarrassed. I'm probably turning red now, and I can just turn off my webcam. Isn't that great? But I think, like, acknowledging the emotions is a really important part of talking about racism and the legacy of racism in our culture, and acknowledging the psychological barriers, I think, is really important too. I've also found great inspiration and very helpful guidance in talking about racism in the psychology classroom from Beverly Daniel Tatum, who is former president of Spelman University and a wonderful psychologist. There's a great book of hers pictured there. She starts with these working assumptions. She's taught about race and racism in the psychology classroom for a long time. Talks about racism as a pervasive aspect of US socialization. Racism is everywhere. And that's just going to be a working assumption. I mean, I think some of that you can help students with, but just letting students know that's going to be working assumption. Prejudice is distinct from racism. That's a really, really key point that psychology can help hammer home, that we all have interpersonal biases and prejudices. That's a part of cognitive psychology, that we all have some sort of bias. I probably have some bias towards lacrosse players due to some bad past experiences. Sometimes I share that in class, sometimes I don't. But we all have biases. We all see patterns and have biases, but that's distinct from racism when it's separated from social power. So racism comes from institutions and social power. Racism as a system operates in our country to advantage whites, right? That's a working assumption, and I think it's important to state that. This last way of talking about racism is pervasive, and children are taught racism. We can't be blamed for what we are taught. I try to talk about my own personal experiences here and ways in which I was taught about racism that I didn't even realize at the time, ways in which I was socialized as a white person in the white workplace, in different environments. And we can't be blamed for being socialized into a society, right? So it's not your fault that you have grown up in a certain society, but as adults and as we come into adulthood, it is our responsibility to understand the truth and to seek to change our socialization, to seek to be honest with ourselves about our lives, about our country, about our psychology, and seek to change that. And that leads to the final reminder from Beverly Tatum that change is possible, that yes, racism is pervasive, but change is possible. And we can start with interpersonal change, but then also see how interpersonal change can lead to social change. Unfortunately, it's at 2 o'clock. I'm going to go to my end to big lessons. Let me get to them. Here we go. There we go. So some big lessons I have for psychology of crisis is listening to people from the future. So the future is unevenly distributed, and I think listening to people who have experienced these crises, who are experiencing them now, who will experience them, is an important part, and they can have psychological lessons for us. And in many ways, they have tools for us to listen to. I think some of the discussion on racism and the psychology of racism that I found very influential, and is much more a psychological lens, is that we're all on a journey. I hope I've given you a sense of how I'm still on my own journey here. I haven't figured it all out. And I think that's important to address to our students and help them feel open to learning more and to growing. Having an empathetic view towards our students as being at different parts on their journey. And if they want to keep moving, that's what matters. That they don't need to be pure and perfect, but they need to be on a journey of progress. And then seeing like a psychologist can help, that using psychological tools, using developmental lenses, using cognitive lenses, thinking about thoughts, behaviors, thinking about cultures, thinking about how our brain influences our immune system, can be really useful tools for addressing these crises and understanding them. Okay, thank you so much for your time and attention. I'm going to go to just webcam, and I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope it's been valuable for you.
Me.
And I'd be happy to stick around and talk for as long as anyone would like to talk or have any questions.